It is great to welcome to the program today Dr. John Gartner, who is the founder of Duty to Warn and co-editor of Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness, and the Mind of Donald Trump. He also taught in the Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Medical Center for 28 years. So let's sort of go to the beginning if we can. I mean, when we're talking about an analysis of a public figure, like Donald Trump, what can be deduced without an in-person examination and what cannot? Because this has been a big issue in terms of the sort of mental health assessments, to call them something, that have been done of the president.
Yeah, actually, we can infer just about everything. What people don't understand is that the personal interview is not the gold standard of psychiatric assessment, especially if you're dealing with a liar. If you're dealing with a liar, doing an interview may not even be that helpful because they're not motivated to give you honest information. They're not a valid or an honest reporter. In fact, we changed our diagnostic system in 1980 when we adopted the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And the main reason we changed it was to have diagnostic criteria that were based on observable behaviors. In the past, it had been based on Freudian psychoanalysis, which was very speculative. But the DSM is based on observable behaviors. So if I can observe your behavior, or if I can talk to someone who can observe your behavior, I can form a valid diagnosis.
And when it comes to Donald Trump, to sort of get us into that conversation, what are the conditions or diagnoses that you believe can be accurately made, again, without the in-person interview, which you've just sort of described why that's not ultimately completely necessary?
Right. One of the reasons that Donald Trump is so dangerous is he actually suffers from multiple conditions. But the first one that I want to talk about is something called malignant narcissism. It's a personality disorder that was first introduced by Erich Fromm, who escaped the Nazis in 1934, to explain the psychology of dictators, what he called the essence of evil. And it has four components. Narcissism, of course, only I can fix it, and he knows more about everything than everyone, but also paranoia. So his crazy conspiracy theories and his demonization of the press, of the opposition, of minorities, of immigrants, and this constant feeling that he's a victim and that he's aggrieved. And antisocial personality disorder, sometimes called sociopathy. So this is someone who routinely lies, who violates and exploits the rights of other people, who has no remorse over the harm that he causes, who violates norms and laws. So really, this is the criminal personality. These are predators without a conscience. And then finally, the fourth component is sadism, actually enjoying harming other people. So, for example, with the zero tolerance policy, the cruelty was not a bug, it was a feature. There was actually an element of pleasure that he gets from crushing weaker people underneath his boot like a bully. Erich Fromm told us three things. One, this is the essence of evil, the closest psychiatry can come to defining a human monster. Secondly, they get worse over time, not better. And remember when everyone was so optimistic that he was going to pivot and become more presidential? Well, what Erich Fromm taught us is that, in fact, these types of personalities get dramatically worse once they gain political power.
To pick on just one of those areas there, when we consider the effect of these traits, of these conditions, on specifically the job of president, what are the ways that to you are sort of standing out in terms of where we should be most concerned? Is it the obvious, like this guy could launch nuclear weapons, or is it sort of more pedestrian and day-to-day than that?
Well, I think we need to be worried at every level. How did Hitler affect Germany? He destroyed the country and millions of people, innocent people, in the process. Yes, we do need to be worried about nuclear war. Malignant narcissistic leaders almost always do start wars. They do it to expand their grandiosity because they feel they should be kings of the world. They do it because they're paranoid, so they think they're under attack. Or they perceive themselves as being under attack. And because they are sadistic, they actually enjoy, in a very perverse way, the process of creating mass destruction. These are malevolent people. These are actually people who revel in destruction. So there's that. So we do need to worry about his making a nuclear decision. Either Eric Fromm said these people actually verge on the delusional. So they have grandiose delusions, they have paranoid delusions. So he might actually make a decision about nuclear war in a state of psychosis, responding to a delusion and not even to reality. Then we have to add the fact that he's also in a state of cognitive decline. If you look at the interviews that he gave in the 1980s, he spoke in polished paragraphs. He was able to finish a sentence. He showed a very high level of vocabulary. Now his vocabulary has shrunk dramatically. He can hardly finish a sentence without derailing into an irrelevancy. He repeats himself over and over again. He overuses superlatives. All of these are signs that we see in people who have an organically based cognitive decline. So he's not demented, but he is probably in a state we call pre-dementia, where someone is declining, but they haven't hit the bottom of the hill yet. So the other issue is that he might not even be cognitively able to understand all the issues that might be happening in a nuclear crisis. You look at how Kennedy handled the nuclear missile crisis. One of our writers talks about that, and the complexity and the sophistication and the empathy he had to use for his opponent to be able to find a faith-saving solution that avoided nuclear war. But we also have to worry about him in other contexts. The ZTP policy, if it hadn't been stopped by the outroar of the public, his plan was to separate hundreds of thousands of children from their parents and put them in camps, in concentration camps. The original meaning of concentration camp was not a death camp. The original meaning is to concentrate a portion of the population that you think is undesirable because of their race or their religion or their beliefs, to separate them from the general population and concentrate them in some other place. So now we've taken these people who are applying for asylum, these poor Hispanic immigrants, and we've demonized them. And to save America from their criminal activity and their raping, we need to isolate them in these camps and separate them from their children.
Yeah,
so
no, I think so. I think people to not dig so much into the policy per se, because I think we've discussed that quite a bit. I think the most interesting angle for our audience would be sort of the medical component here. There will be people who say that there is something irresponsible about saying that these are the conditions which this person has, that in the same way that you can point to the seeming disdain for Hispanic immigrants as indicative of a condition which might jeopardize his ability to be president, others might say he sees that as a necessary means to the end, which is protecting the country. It's not my view. I know it's not your view, but let's address that head on, because there will be people who hear this and they'll say that there's something irresponsible about ignoring the Goldwater rule, making the diagnosis, not having interviewed the individual, and advocating for the removal of the president on that basis. How can we, in an objective way, address that concern? Because much of these diagnoses is, at least through media, there's a subjective element to it, even though, of course, you are a medical professional and the other people that you're working with are as well. There is some element of subjectivity when it's coming through media.
Actually, I have to disagree.
Okay.
Because, first of all, I've observed more of Donald Trump's behavior than all of my psychotherapy patients put together. So when I meet them in my office for an hour a week, I know what they tell me about their life. In Donald Trump's case, I'm observing his behavior directly.
I guess the counter to that would be...
I'm reading his words directly on Twitter. And one of the things we use in psychiatry is what we call significant others who give reports. And we have dozens of people who are close to the president, who work with the president, who are on his team, who have leaked to people in the media that they're wildly concerned about his mental stability.
Yeah, that's more relevant to me. That's more that actually to me is much more relevant for our conversation. And again, to be clear, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I want to be thorough on the basis of what I know the feedback will be when we've done these interviews before. Could someone say, listen, when Trump is speaking to the press, that's not Donald Trump the person necessarily. It's a character of sorts. When Donald Trump is giving an interview on camera, that is a character of sorts because he knows that he's being filmed. What about that argument? How do we address that head on?
Well, look, Donald Trump is a liar, but he tells two kinds of lies. One are the lies that any competent con man tells to deceive other people.
Mm.
And so when you say he's playing this role and he's saying the Russia's a hoax and this is fake news, you could just simply say he's a psychopath who's lying, who's trying to manipulate us. And so this entire caricature or this whole persona is just an act. In and of itself, by the way, that would still make him a highly dangerous demagogue.
Mm.
One of the writers in our book who presents a wonderfully compelling case that argues against what some of the other authors are saying is she's saying he's not mad. He's not a madman. He's following the strong man's playbook. That, in other words, kind of a different version of the Eric Fromm argument, but saying that he is a authoritarian dictator, and this is how authoritarian dictators manipulate their societies to erode democracy. So if that's the best case scenario, that's pretty bad.
That is still pretty bad. That is still pretty bad.
The worst case scenario is he's actually psychotic, and he's actually delusional, and he actually doesn't know that what he's saying is a lie because he lives in his own reality. I think that both are true about Donald Trump, that he is somewhat fluidly goes back and forth between simple lies, like he told in Helsinki, when he argued that he believed Putin, that Putin didn't interfere in the election, when we're going to find that he and Putin planned the interference in the election. So that's just a simple lie, but a very important one. But when he says things like he had the biggest crowd size, that sounds like a grandiose delusion, or that Obama bugged his offices. That sounds like a paranoid delusion. Those lies didn't help him in any way politically. They actually hurt his credibility. So when all of the wild conspiracy theories that he's endorsed, you have to think that this person's capacity to he bends reality to fit his narcissistic needs and his paranoid fantasies. So to what extent is he just manipulating us, and to what extent is he actually fooling himself or actually deluded? It's not always easy to tell at any given moment in time, but he does both.
Very briefly, in the limited time we have left, the 25th Amendment is the path that more than likely would be that if the grounds for removal is on the basis that you and some of your colleagues are describing. What's step one in that path?
Well, the problem is the 25th Amendment can only be invoked by the cabinet and the vice president.
Yes.
And because we have a Republican Party that is completely corrupt and entirely invested in colluding with Russia, they will never invoke the 25th Amendment, even if he was, wildly hallucinating and babbling incoherently. They're just that committed to wresting power at the expense of the Constitution in the country. So they are utterly corrupt. They have no bottom. They have no limit. There is no point where they would draw the line and say enough. Realistically, the only chance we have to remove him is to flood the polls in November, to create a blue wave big enough that they can't manipulate it with Russian hacking or Russian influence in the voting machines, which is a great concern of mine, in order to win back Congress so that we can actually do honest investigations, have honest oversight, and those investigations will lead to impeachment.
In the end, it gets back to voting, as I've been saying for months at this point. We've been speaking with John Gartner. He is the founder of Duty to Warn and co-editor of Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump. Thank you so much for talking to us about this today.
Thank you for having me.